Welcome back, everyone. Today we're bringing you an explainer on a highly controversial, deeply analytical new documentary titled Villain Created by System. This is a pretty profound investigation into the historical narratives we all just sort of accept as absolute truth. Now, I want to be clear right up front. We're going to strictly maintain an objective, investigative lens today as we unpack the core claims of this source material. This documentary challenges us to look beyond mainstream historical summaries and ask some really uncomfortable questions about power, global systems, and how history is ultimately recorded.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll decode the system's villain, then examine the rise of a dictator. After that, we'll look at other historical genocides, trace the history of anti-Semitism, explore collective failure, and finally ask, who writes history?
Starting right off with Section 1, the system's villain, decoding the narrative.
The source material kicks off with this really striking modern paradox. You look around online today, and the internet is suddenly filled with content praising Adolf Hitler, while mainstream history obviously paints a picture of unparalleled, singular evil. To figure out how this narrative was constructed, the documentary opens with a chilling quote from the dictator himself. "My spirit will rise from the grave, and the world will see I was right." The creators use this incredibly unsettling statement to ask if our standard historical understanding is actually the complete picture, or if maybe key pieces have been intentionally left out.
Which brings us right to the central thesis of the documentary. Was he true, absolute evil, or a strategically manufactured villain? Now listen, I want to be incredibly clear here. Our explainer is neutrally investigating exactly how the documentary answers this. We are exploring the source's claim that while his actions were undeniably horrific, his status as the singular, ultimate evil of the 20th century might actually have been a convenient construction by a global system that desperately needed a scapegoat.
Moving right along to Section 2, Rise of a Dictator, a Product of Circumstance.
Let's move to and see how this builds, because the source argues that to understand the monster, you really have to understand the socioeconomic vacuum that created him. It was a disastrous set of circumstances. Think about it. In 1914, he's literally just a courier boy in World War I. Then, in this crazy twist of fate in 1918, a British soldier named Henry Tandy actually has him in his crosshairs but spares his life. Following Germany's defeat, you have the wildly punishing Treaty of Versailles in 1919. This economically crippled the nation. We're talking hyperinflation so severe that people were carrying money in wheelbarrows just to buy a loaf of bread. And then the Great Depression hits in 1929, completely shattering the German spirit. It was exactly this environment, desperation, anger, total systemic collapse, that paved the way for him to be appointed chancellor in 1933.
But how did he actually get absolute power? Well, the documentary emphasizes that the system itself handed it to him. Elite politicians like Franz von Papen and President Hindenburg appointed him chancellor because they arrogantly believed they could control him. They thought, hey, we'll just use him as a puppet to stabilize the country. And they were disastrously wrong. Within a month, the Reichstag Parliament building catches fire. He immediately blames his political opponents, uses the crisis to seize emergency powers, and rams through the Enabling Act. Just like that, German democracy ends and his dictatorship is entirely legalized.
Let's jump into Section 3, Other Historical Genocides. The statistics of tragedy.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the documentary argues that to understand the manufactured singular villain, we have to look at the grim statistics of tragedy globally. If we convert the figures presented by the source into millions, the scale is staggering. Mao Zedong's policies, an estimated 30 to 40 million deaths. Joseph Stalin's purges in the Holodomor famine, over 20 million deaths. Hideki Tojo overseeing the brutal Unit 731 biological experiments, 5 to 10 million deaths. The documentary impartially lays out these massive, unimaginable death tolls to ask one critical question. Why, when we discuss mass atrocities, is the global focus so disproportionately fixed on just one man?
The source claims the answer boils down to a fundamental difference in public relations. The dictator in Germany basically said the quiet part out loud. He openly admitted to his genocidal intent, broadcasting his hatred in his speeches and his writings. Other leaders, however, they mask their mass killings under highly sanitized political terms. Mao branded his as a cultural revolution or great leap forward. Stalin framed his as national security and agricultural development. So the documentary's core thesis here is that Hitler became the ultimate centralized villain because he didn't even bother hiding his evil. That made him the easiest, most convenient target for a world that desperately needed a clear bad guy to contrast its own actions against.
Which leads us straight into Section 4, History of Anti-Semitism, a millennia-old prejudice.
A major argument of the source is that this dictator absolutely did not invent hatred against Jewish people. It was a pre-existing condition. Look at the sheer scale of the timeline here.
The documentary lists historical expulsions of Jewish populations from various regions globally, stretching all the way back to ancient times in 722 BC, England in 1290, Spain in 1492. The source points out that for thousands of years, thanks to complex religious contradictions and societal scapegoating, this prejudice was a widespread global phenomenon. It was literally an underlying current in the system long before the 20th century even began.
And this brilliantly illustrates just how global this sentiment really was. The documentary points to the surprising complicity of prominent global figures, like the American industrialist Henry Ford. Ford actually published a fiercely anti-Semitic series of articles called The International Jew, which influenced millions around the world. In fact, his writings were so admired by the German dictator that Ford was awarded the Grand Cross of the German Eagle in 1938. So the source is making a clear point. This hatred wasn't just isolated to one radical faction in one country, it was a deeply systemic global issue.
So what the documentary is explaining here is essentially a masterclass in dark political manipulation. The dictator didn't invent the hatred, he weaponized it. He capitalized on public anger over the massive economic collapse, exploited those ancient deep-seated religious conflicts we just talked about, and scapegoated a micro-minority for Germany's defeat in World War I. He didn't build the machine from scratch, he just centralized and mechanized a prejudice that the global system already harbored.
Moving into the final stages now, Section 5, Collective Failure, the Shared Guilt of World War II.
Here, the documentary zooms out and presents a fascinating theory about shared global responsibility and the absolute power of financial systems. It points to a really intriguing pattern regarding leaders who dared to bypass private central banking. Figures like Abraham Lincoln, JFK, Muammar Gaddafi, all of whom attempted to operate their nation's finances outside the established global banking system, were assassinated. The source then notes that Germany in 1933 did exactly this. By creating their own currency, known as Mefo bills, Germany completely bypassed international banks. The result? They dropped unemployment from 30% down to 2% and their GDP skyrocketed. The documentary implies this economic rebellion made them an immediate existential threat to global financial powers, adding a massive complex economic layer to the outbreak of the war.
Furthermore, the source argues that World War II was, in essence, a shared evil. The dictator could not have achieved what he did without the active enablement of global powers. I mean, the United Kingdom signed the Munich Agreement, basically giving Germany a free pass to expand. The Soviet Union literally signed a secret pact to divide Poland with Germany, and major global corporations were deeply complicit too. IBM's punchcard technology was tragically used to identify populations, while companies like BMW and Ford actively supported the regime economically.
And that brings us to Section 6, Who Writes History? The Power of the Victor.
After laying out all this evidence of shared geopolitical guilt, the documentary asks us to step back and reflect on how history is curated. So the crucial point is summarized perfectly by this quote from the documentary. The one who wins the war writes the history and always portrays themselves as the hero. The source asserts that in order for the victorious powers to be seen as undisputed heroes, despite their own devastating bombings, imperial policies, and pre-war complicity, they desperately needed a singular, ultimate villain, and the German dictator, who openly broadcasted his immense cruelty, fit that role perfectly.
Now I want to emphasize this point incredibly strongly, just as the source material does. The documentary does not justify the atrocities. It does not absolve the dictator of the Holocaust or the war. It states clearly, without a doubt, that he was a horrific villain. However, it critiques the hypocrisy of the global system, arguing that framing him as the absolutely only villain allows the rest of the world to just wash its hands of its own systemic cruelties, complicities, and genocides.
And that brings us to the end of our explainer, with a thought that should definitely stick with you long after we wrap up here. If the global system, from international banks to rival empires to multinational corporations, share the guilt for the horrors of the 20th century, who is truly writing our history? Are we learning the objective truth, or are we just reading the convenient script of the victors? It's a profound question, and one that absolutely invites deeper exploration into everything we think we know. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we'll see you on the next explainer.